Talk more about the situation in Iran. We're joined by Behnam Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Thank you very much for being with us. So, would you say this was just a protest about those very severe water shortages, or was this a call for regime change?
Well, pleasure to be with you. What the Iranian people have shown now for really about a half decade and counting is that they'll use any vector of grievance, environmental grievances, social grievances, definitely economic grievances, and even religious grievances as a way to channel and signal their larger political grievances with the Islamist regime that rules them. This is something we really saw on steroids, if you will, starting with protests in 2017 and continuing into 2020 and even into the COVID era. So just this summer, for instance, there was an environmental trigger to protests. And again, this is in some ways being replicated on social media, but it is an indicator of things to come, which is the Iranian people are signaling that they're tired of this regime and they'll use any grievance to make this larger claim.
Well, the government does seem to have been quite conciliatory when it comes to these particular protests. We heard the agriculture minister, I think it was, saying that he felt ashamed that he couldn't provide these people with water. This seems a very different handling of the protest compared to the brutal crackdown we saw back in 2019.
Well, I don't necessarily see it that way. There's not immediate mass violence, or hopefully not yet, by this regime. But what the regime has shown in those larger protests is that it doesn't hesitate to use mass violence. It has different tactics to try to co-opt or control protesters, to try to isolate them. And what you've seen is occasionally them try to pretend to placate them through rhetoric. But what those farmers and those citizens of Isfahan and those residents of Isfahan province need is not just rhetoric. They need aid, they need assistance. And the reason they've taken to using an economic or an environmental issue to make a larger political claim is that such rhetoric has been occasionally deployed before by various different Iranian governments on various different issues, and yet again, they continue to be forgotten and neglected. So ultimately, I wouldn't read too much into some of the comments by the cabinet of Ibrahim Raisi in response to what was happening on the streets.
And do we have a clear idea of what happened over the weekend in Isfahan? Do we know how many people took part in those protests? Do we know were there any arrests, anything like that?
I don't have any empirical data yet. I've been looking at the same English language reporting covering the issue, as well as some of the Persian language Twitter comments covering this issue. So I don't have any kind of direct empirical data to give you other than what's already been reported. But I think these do tend to land a blow far beyond their numbers for the regime's psychology, that every time they try to force people to come out on the streets to signal something in their favor, that they end up hearing slogans that they don't necessarily want to hear. And again, to them, and then really to the international community, I should say, it's more proof that the Iranian people will use every opportunity afforded to them to signal their dissatisfaction, not just with the government, but with the larger regime.
We saw the London-based Iran International put up some footage of people changing the name of a sign that had originally read was written Martyrs of Gaza. They changed it to Martyrs of November 2019, the protest we were just talking about. Do most Iranians have a view? Do they oppose their government's support for Hamas?
What we've really seen, and this actually predates 2017, is that starting in 2009 occasionally, but really being ramped up in 2017, most of the protests will begin to feature a foreign policy vector or a foreign policy criticism. And in a sense, the Iranian people, when they've been protesting and they've been critiquing the regime's material and political and financial support for entities like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, or even the Assad regime in Syria, they're doing it from the perspective of if you could say, Iran first, or a nationalist perspective, critiquing the regime's Islamist foreign policy, telling them to have different spending priorities, telling them to have a fundamentally different foreign and security policy. And what these slogans do tell you is that, the West does have an opportunity here, both to support the Iranian people from a perspective of its strategy, as well as a perspective of its values, because fundamentally they're signaling that they have different values from the regime that overrules them. And that materially means a different approach to terror entities in Hamas and terror entities in Gaza and Lebanon and in Syria.
Well, some in Europe or the United States might argue that actually what the Iranian people need is the lifting of those international sanctions, and we are, of course, headed to the nuclear talks with Iran at the end of the month. What would you say to those people?
Well, certainly Iran does need major macroeconomic reform. It needs banking reform. It needs financial reform. But sanctions are not. As long as you have a constellation of entities owned, controlled by, and dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, you are not really going to have a genuine middle class. You're not really going to have a genuine private sector inside of Iran, because these state interests in these parastatal institutions have punctured a large portion of the Iranian economy already. As when you add on to that, of course, not just entities owned or controlled by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but entities owned or controlled by Iran's supreme leader, who has a large financial slush fund in that country that uses and abuses charitable and religious institutions for political purposes. I think you have the very bleak economic picture of Iran that you have today. And that's why even at the height of sanctions, the Iranian people in 2018, 2019 were protesting, our enemies here, they lie when they say it's in America.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.